Welcome. I'm Tom Saffold, your host for George Washington Speaks. In this edition, entitled Loyal Englishmen, George Washington reflects on the relationship between Britain and her American colonies in October of 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War, and known as the French and Indian War in the colonies. He talks about the tension between Britain and the colonies due to the mercantile system, the high cost of the war, and the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and how we came through it all to remain loyal Englishmen.
We are American colonists and loyal Englishmen. Although most of us were not born in England, we were proud to fight alongside other Englishmen. We were proud that the King and Parliament had entrusted us as American colonists to govern ourselves. Each colony had a different charter with the Crown, and each one had a representative legislature that was acceptable to the King. In Virginia, we had the House of Burgesses, of which I was a member of for many years. We had representatives that passed laws, and we taxed ourselves to meet our own needs as a colony. And as in many other colonies, our royal governor reported our activities to Parliament and the King. It is helpful to understand that the individual colonies were populated by independent-minded people, that in many cases had their own ideas how things should run and didn't agree with each other, especially in Massachusetts. However, in Virginia, we tended to debate topics openly, but eventually worked out our own differences and maintained order in our colony. The 13 colonies also found many differences with each other and disagreed on such issues as colonial boundaries, currency exchange, and laws that were contradictory. However, when it came to the French and Indian War, we were united and we fought as loyal English subjects. And in doing so, we felt that we benefited the Crown, the aristocracy, and the entire empire. Before the war, the Crown and English businessmen benefited from the mercantile system. It required that the sale of natural resources from the American colonies, such as iron ore, copper, lumber, furs, grains, tobacco, fish, whale products, all of it, would go through England. Those raw materials would then be refined and then manufactured in England into finished products, such as paper goods, books, cloth, kitchen utensils, guns, knives, furniture, and much, much more. Those finished items would be then sold back to the colonies. Now, the prices of the raw materials which we sold to the English merchants was fairly low, which is typical, but the cost of the manufactured items they produce and that we bought back from them was much higher. As a result, since the cost of what we bought from England was much higher than what we were paid for our natural resources, we had to borrow money from English banks, often at high interest rates, in order to keep our businesses going. The English businessmen and the Crown, through taxes on both the raw materials coming into England and the manufactured products going out, benefited them greatly. And when times were good, we had the benefit of a ready market for our products in England, and the income from those transactions allowed the colonies to prosper and grow. However, when there were droughts, when there was crop pest infestations or severe storms or wars that impacted the flow of trade, the colonies were the first to suffer and the first to lose their property and livelihoods. And yet, we were part of the largest empire in the world, which controlled the seas and the land, and we benefited from the safety and the stability that the empire provided us. When the English Empire prevailed over France in the 7 Years' War, settlers were anxious to expand into the large, fertile territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River that France lost to England. Of course, we knew that the cost of war was extremely high. Our mother country enlisted Englishmen, trained them to fight as a unit and to respond to commands and clothe them. They provided coats, shirts, breeches, shoes, socks, and hats for both summer and winter. They supplied the soldiers with muskets and bayonets, black powder and cartouche boxes, shot, bullets, and everything they needed to fight, and trained them in how to use them. During training, the soldiers had to be fed and housed, and then they needed to be transported to the place they were needed. Deploying them to the nearby European continent was not that expensive, but shipping them 3,000 miles to the colonies was very expensive. In addition to the food and care on an ocean voyage of 4, 6, or even 8 weeks, the soldiers needed many things when they arrived in the colonies. They needed tents, cots, blankets, food, training, and doctors and nurses to tend to their illnesses and injuries. If a war can be won in a year or two, those initial troops may be all that would be needed. But the French and Indian War lasted nearly 8 years. That meant that England had to supply replacements for the soldiers who were injured and needed to heal, and others that died of illnesses or perished in battle. So England had to continue to enlist and to train more soldiers and ship them to the colonies throughout the 8 years of war. We colonists faced many of these same hardships and dangers throughout the war, so we knew the high cost for England and in the colonies. And where did the king get the funds to pay for all of this cost of war? We all knew that initially the crown expended the funds they had on hand. But when those monies were depleted, they borrowed from other nations that were allied with them, and then eventually started to borrow from English aristocrats, businessmen, and merchants. And when that was not enough money to pay for the war, they went to the English people and established revenue-raising taxes to pay off the debt. After Great Britain defeated France and her allies, the Crown and Parliament began to make some alarming changes that affected the American colonies. The first change was the Proclamation of 1763 by the King and Parliament. It stated that the lands between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River would not be available for settlement by the colonies. We were forbidden to settle those lands. We objected and said they could not do that, since that was part of the reason we fought and died in the war. And now the king was saying that we could not settle there. And not only that, but Parliament insisted that the thousands of settlers that were already there, that had cleared the land, built homes, and lost husbands and wives and children, now they had to come back to the east side of the Appalachians. Why, that caused a great uproar in the colonies and on the frontier. In a show of defiance, not all of the colonists already settled there came back. However, our colonial governments did not argue the point. They were glad that the war had finally ended and we could get back to a peaceful life. We soon found out, though, that the proclamation was only the first step in a series of larger encroachments yet to come against us. Not by the French or by the Indians, but by England, by our mother country. Changes that were not only difficult to accept, but became more and more oppressive as the years went on.
As we noted, although England prevailed over France and her allies in the 7 Years' War, she was deeply in debt. Britain needed to raise income quickly to pay for its debt, and at the same time attempt to lower its cost to run the government. To that end, the King and Parliament instituted taxes and policies in the colonies in America, the Caribbean, and India, which unexpectedly changed its relationship with them all. In the next edition, we'll see how Parliament tried to hoodwink its American colonies by raising the cost to regulate the cost of sugar coming into the colonies, and if the colonists even noticed. Join me right now next time as we follow what happened in the next edition of George Washington Speaks, The Sugar Act.